Hi friends, so I wanted to talk about the Overton window and the middle ground fallacy. Bear with me here because those are two actually I think really helpful ways of understanding something that goes on in terms of public perception. So the Overton window refers to the way public discourse is framed in terms of what is considered reasonable. So forget about Overton, that's just the name of the person who came up with it, not really important for our discussion. Just picture that there's this frame, and the frame is situated somewhere on the spectrum of beliefs or claims about a particular topic. So let's take the claims that there was rampant voter fraud, right, that the Trump party alleged about last year's election. So on one side of the spectrum, you have the claim there was widespread, rampant corruption and voter fraud that stole the election from Trump. Okay? On the other side of the spectrum, you have the fact that every single court case, I've seen numbers, somewhere between 60 court cases and 90 court cases, there are a whole bunch of them, they were all thrown out. They were all dismissed. There was no evidence presented that at any level of the legal system, in multiple counties and in multiple states, and then going up through the legal system, at no point was there a judge, and a lot of these were Republican judges and some of them were Trump-appointed judges. At no point did they say, yeah, I think this case has merit. They were all dismissed. Okay, so on the one side, you have the claims of voter fraud. On the other side, you have the facts as litigated in the courts. And so the Overton window, the window through which the public perceives the facts of that particular topic, should be over here. But if you see enough misleading posts, if you see enough propaganda and false reports and misinformation, the window gets dragged over this way. So that there's going to be a certain percentage of people who think that the truth must lie somewhere in the middle. And so the window of how they're perceiving, how the issue is being framed in their minds, now includes false claims and perpetuates the idea that, well, I can see both sides. And so you can see how, for those of us who want to not be biased, for those of us who are open-minded, for those of us who want to see things from different perspectives and not get caught in some kind of binary or polarization or demonizing of the other side, it's easy to go, well, hold on a second. The truth must lie somewhere in the middle, because these two seem complete voter fraud, no voter fraud whatsoever. They sound like two very extreme positions. And extremes surely are unreasonable. Reasonable people end up somewhere in the middle. But this is a perfect example of how no, the facts and the evidence are over here. It actually is binary. These claims are 100% false. Now, may there have been like small instances? Yeah, there are in every election. There are little things that happen. There are inconsistencies. There sometimes are people who are trying to enact voter fraud, but you have to have a sense of proportion about the types of claims that are being made and the implications within, what this topic is really all about. So that's the Overton window as using that kind of example. So propagandists, conspiracy theorists, extremist political operatives, religious fundamentalist groups are really good at putting out stuff that moves the Overton window, right? That creates a false sense of what is reasonable to consider possibly being true, and that perpetuates the middle ground fallacy that I think people in our community are particularly vulnerable to, especially on topics that we don't know enough about. And so this is where the topic of the COVID vaccines comes in. So because of the effectiveness of propaganda campaigns that utilize algorithms to hijack our news feeds, to serve us up information that we're already sympathetic to, that perpetuate in-group beliefs that we have, specifically now on the topic of vaccines, the Overton window on this topic has been moved in such a way for most people in the yoga, wellness, ecstatic dance, mind-body healing, holistic, alternative medicine kind of demographic. On vaccines, it's been moved in a way that makes it seem as if conspiracy-style claims, false assertions about a link with autism, the idea that Big Pharma is covering up how dangerous vaccines really are, all of these sorts of claims that have been debunked and discredited, that the evidence does not support, The window has been moved in such a way that it seems as if the open-minded, reasonable stance is to consider weighing these two sides and ending up somewhere in the middle. And that is just false on the general topic of vaccines. It's false on the topic of whether or not vaccines are linked to autism. It's false on the claims that there are way more, terrible adverse reactions and long-term side effects that are linked to vaccines. There just is not evidence to support any of that stuff. It's been looked at in depth across multiple studies, across many, many thousands of people. It's just not true. But the window has been moved in such a way that we go, oh, okay, here's what the people who trust the science are saying, and we don't trust them because we know that big pharma lies, right? So you have the hook of the conspiracy style of reasoning, which is a bad way of thinking about things, but it's hooked into something that's true, right? So we can look at the corruption of Vioxx, right? Look up that case if you want to. A genuine case of big pharma, absolute horrific corruption. They were busted, huge fines. It's a big news story. That's true, okay? You look at Tuskegee, terrible, atrocious case of racist abuse in the name of medical science that went on, many decades ago for several decades. Absolutely appalling. So a case of malevolence and not caring about human well-being from a racist point of view, right? Horrible. Then you have thalidomide, a morning sickness drug that resulted in all kinds of birth defects going back to the 50s. Terrible. So you have cases like those, and you take those cases and you say, well, because of these, I believe I can't trust anything that big pharma says. And already you're in that conspiracist kind of mindset. Why? Because you've gone from specifics to generalities, and you're assuming in a paranoid way that you're being lied to and that these people can't be trusted and that the whole enterprise is corrupt. And that is just simply not true. And in fact, cases like thalidomide, Tuskegee, what was the other one, Vioxx, they have to be seen within the much larger context in order to understand what they mean. You have to be able to pull back far enough, look at the industry as a whole, look at the history of medical science, right? Look at what life is like as a result of the enormous, incredible, spectacular success of medical science in terms of what our lives are like now in countries that have good medical infrastructure compared to, say, 100 and even 200 years ago. Yeah? So you combine those things, you combine a kind of conspiracist mindset, you combine the Overton window being moved by algorithms and by propaganda and by carefully constructed misinformation that appeals to things that we're sympathetic to because we want to be holistic and we want to be natural and we don't think that just taking a pill is the cure for everything. Hey, I'm on board with all of that as well. I get it. I'm someone who has been sympathetic to these things in the past too, for those legitimate reasons, buying into illegitimate claims, false claims, moving the window such that it seems like the falsehoods and the truths are sort of equally debating with one another, and reasonable people fall somewhere in the middle. So the combination of those things all comes together now around the COVID vaccines to make it seem as if, even though the window really should be over here, here's what the data shows. Right? The data shows that 100 to 200,000 people have gone through phase 3 trials, and the vaccines have turned out to be incredibly safe and incredibly effective. Even though that's scaling now up to getting around 80, 90 million people who've been vaccinated, and those results are holding true over time. And we're continuing to follow the people who've gone through phase 3 trials, and it's overwhelmingly the case that these are safe and effective vaccines. Despite that, there are arguments on the other side of the spectrum that are either based on false claims or misunderstanding the science or being appropriately skeptical because, like, hey, we don't know what's going to happen with the variants, and we don't know about what's going to happen way down the line with like long-term, like going into the years. And some of this technology is new, and so we're not entirely sure about it, even though the data shows what it shows, and even though the new technology has been in development for decades. Still, there are these legitimate concerns that then start to frame the question in a way that makes it seem like we should be mistrustful, makes it seem like the reasonable position is to hold off and be hesitant and not take the vaccines, and well, we don't know how long immunity is going to last, all of those sorts of questions. And it's like, Well, yeah, those are valid questions, but they don't change the simple fact that if we can get to about 80% of the population either having been vaccinated or having recovered from being infected, because a certain amount of people have gone through that, if we can get to 80%, the pandemic is over. Economies reopen. We start getting out of this a terrible period. Our lives change. Things start to go back somewhat to normal, even though we still have to be careful in some ways for a period of time, and even though there's all sorts of ways that it won't be normal, back to the old normal, it'll be a new normal that we head into. The way that happens is by getting at least 80% of the population immune. And any perceived risks of being vaccinated are tiny compared to the risks, both personally and collectively, of continuing to wait. The longer we wait, the longer the pandemic goes on, and the more we put ourselves and the people around us at risk. So especially if you're an older person, and there's a lot of people who are in those older age ranges who can get the vaccine right now, that have been part of the yoga and dance and wellness community for a long time, the more you wait, the more the likelihood is that you'll get infected and that you might die. You might go through a protracted, horrible illness and die. If you get one of the vaccines, one thing we know for sure is that the likelihood of you being hospitalized and dying as a result of a COVID infection goes down to a very, very, very small percentage if you've been vaccinated with any of the vaccines that are currently out there. So any of the arguments that say, well, they're not entirely, what about the new variants and you could still get sick? Yeah, even with the new variants, the vaccines will still protect you against hospitalization and death. They'll turn it into actually being what denialists have said all along, which is just perhaps a mild or moderate flu. So that's my shtick on the middle ground fallacy and the Overton window. I hope you got something out of it. Talk to you soon.